Humanity had inherited the stars with the brash, confident swagger of a species that believed it had earned them. In the dawn of the 28th century, the Terran Federation was a sprawling, vibrant civilization of 1 trillion souls, scattered across a dozen star systems. They had conquered disease, tamed fusion, and built cities of impossible gleaming beauty on worlds their ancestors had only dreamed of. They were the masters of their own destiny, a noisy, chaotic, and beautiful anomaly in the great silence of the cosmos. Their greatest mystery was not in the stars above, but in the blood that ran through their own veins. Dr. Aris Thorne was a cartographer of that mystery. From his laboratory at the Kepler Institute on Proxima b, he spent his life studying the strange, silent continent that lay dormant in the heart of the human genome. It was a vast, repeating sequence of non-coding DNA, a stretch of genetic material so complex and so ancient that it was colloquially known as the dark genome. It was present in every human being, a shared and inexplicable inheritance that served no discernible biological function. It was a ghost in their machine, a piece of code that did nothing but take up space, and it had fascinated and frustrated scientists for centuries. Aris believed it was the key to understanding their origins, a relic of an evolutionary past so deep it was almost mythological. He had no idea how right and how terribly, tragically wrong he was. The arrival of the progenitors was not an invasion. It was a homecoming. A single vessel, so vast it eclipsed the sun and so elegant it made the most advanced human warships look like crude. Blunt instruments appeared in high orbit over Earth. It did not announce itself with threats or demands. It simply unfolded, its hull of living, pearlescent material blossoming like a great cosmic flower. And it began to sing. The song was not of sound, but of pure conceptual thought, a psionic broadcast that washed over every human mind in the solar system. The message was simple, beautiful, and utterly terrifying. The long silence is over. The garden is ready for its keepers. The experiment has concluded. Prepare for reclamation. The initial reaction was a global wave of awe and disbelief that quickly curdled into a cold, existential dread. This was not a first contact. It was a final judgment. The progenitors, the beings who had, in the deep and silent past of 1 billion years ago, seeded Earth with the first spark of life, had returned. They were not alien invaders. They were their gods, their creators, and they had come home to a garden they had found overgrown with what they considered to be beautiful, but dangerously unpredictable, weeds. Humanity, in all its chaotic, triumphant glory, was not the inheritor of the stars. It was a failed experiment, and the lab was about to be sterilized. The judgment of the progenitors was delivered not as an ultimatum, but as a diagnosis. Their vast, ancient minds, which had observed humanity's brief, violent, and noisy history from a silent distance, had reached a simple, and from their perspective, compassionate conclusion. Humanity was a mistake, a beautiful, complex, and fascinating mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. A single progenitor, a being of pure, shimmering light and impossible geometry, descended from the great vessel and stood in the central chamber of the Terran Federation's Grand Assembly. It did not speak in words, but in a wave of pure, empathic understanding that flooded the minds of the assembled human leaders. It showed them their own history through its eyes. It showed them their wars, not as struggles for freedom or ideology, but as the violent, pointless thrashing of a fevered organism. It showed them their art, not as expressions of profound beauty, but as the complex, chaotic patterns of a developing psychosis. It showed them their love, not as a transcendent bond, but as a dangerous, illogical form of biological codependency that led to irrational and destructive behavior. You are a paradox, the progenitor's thoughts communicated, its empathy a form of profound, cosmic pity. You possess a capacity for creation that is matched only by your capacity for self-destruction. You are a chaotic variable in a serene, orderly universe. You have grown beyond the confines of your garden, and your chaos now threatens to infect the stars. We do not hate you, we pity you. And as your creators, it is our responsibility and our burden to grant you a quiet, peaceful end. Then it activated the Ancestor Protocol. It was not a weapon being fired. It was a key turning in a lock that had been built into every strand of human DNA for 1 billion years. A single, pure, resonant psionic frequency, broadcast from the progenitor vessel, swept across the entire human sphere of influence. It was a frequency that was perfectly attuned to the dark genome, the silent junk DNA that Eris Thorne had spent his life studying. The key found its lock, and the silent, dormant code within every human being began to run. The initial effect was a strange, tingling sensation, a deep, cellular vibration that was felt by every human, on every world at the exact same moment. It was followed by a profound and deeply unnatural sense of peace. A wave of exhaustion washed over the species, a desire to simply lie down, to close one's eyes, to let go. Medical sensors across the Federation went haywire, reporting a simultaneous, species-wide cascade of cellular degradation. The building blocks of their bodies were beginning to unmake themselves. The protocol was working. Humanity was not being killed. It was being politely and irrevocably uninstalled. Eris Thorne experienced the activation of the Ancestor Protocol in his lab on Proxima B, and his first reaction was one of pure, unadulterated scientific awe. The very code he had spent his life trying to understand was now the instrument of his own annihilation. He felt the pull towards nothingness, the gentle, insistent whisper in his cells telling him to dissolve, to return to the primordial, undifferentiated state from which he had come. But even as his body began to weaken, his mind, the insatiably curious, analytical mind of a scientist, rebelled. He was not just a victim. He was an observer. He connected himself to his own biomonitors, his hands trembling with a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration, and he watched himself die. The data that flowed across his screens was breathtaking. The protocol was a masterpiece of biological engineering. It was a de-evolutionary cascade, a program that was systematically and flawlessly reversing his genetic history. It was tracing his lineage backwards, step by step, from Homo sapiens to the early hominids to the first primates to the ancient armored fish that had been his distant aquatic ancestors. It was a clean, elegant, and perfectly linear process, designed to walk a simple, straight path back to the single-celled organism from which all life on Earth had sprung. And that, he realized with a sudden dawning clarity, was its fatal flaw. The progenitors, in all their serene, logical perfection, had made one critical and profoundly arrogant assumption that evolution was a straight line. Human DNA was not a straight line. It was a messy, chaotic, and deeply illogical scrapbook. It was a history of 1 billion years of frantic, desperate adaptation on a violent, competitive, and often catastrophically random planet. It was a jumble of viral code, of symbiotic partnerships with ancient bacteria, of evolutionary dead ends, of mutated genes that had been turned off and on again, of latent abilities that had been discarded and then reabsorbed. The protocol, in its elegant simplicity, was looking for a clean, well-lit highway, and it had just run headfirst into the biological equivalent of a sprawling, ancient, and unmapped city, complete with dark alleys, winding side streets, and 1 billion screaming, contradictory road signs. The glitch began as a flicker in his own bio-readings. The smooth, linear, de-evolutionary cascade began to stutter. A sequence of reptilian DNA dormant for 100 million years suddenly flared to life. The skin on the back of his hand momentarily tightened, the cells shifting into a hard, scaly, diamond-backed pattern before the protocol could correct itself. He felt a sudden phantom sensation, the ghost of a long-vanished tale. The protocol, lost in the chaotic maze of his genome, was no longer just reading the map backwards. It was starting to activate the places it was getting lost in. And then the first reports began to trickle in from the world outside. A dock worker in the city's spaceport had collapsed, not from weakness, but because a set of feathery, vestigial gills had just slid open on the sides of his neck, and he was trying to breathe water in an atmosphere of pure, dry air. A woman on a public transport vehicle had screamed as her fingernails thickened and elongated, hardening into sharp, black, and unmistakably predatory claws. The progenitor's clean, simple program of erasure had encountered a system error, and that error was about to go viral. The sporadic glitches became a pandemic of pure biological chaos. The Ancestor Protocol, designed as a simple, elegant kill switch, had become a species-wide and catastrophic system failure. Instead of de-evolving, humanity was evolving. In every direction, all at once. The silent, peaceful dissolution that the progenitors had intended had become a noisy, terrifying, and agonizingly painful explosion of latent ancestral potential. The human form, which had been the stable, predictable result of millions of years of linear evolution, was now just a suggestion. A starting point for a billion different and often horrific biological improvisations. The body horror was absolute. People did not just grow gills or claws. A man in the city's central plaza felt his spine lengthen and contort, his body twisting as a powerful reptilian tail burst from the base of his back, sending him crashing to the ground. A woman's eyes, in the space of a few terrifying seconds, migrated to the sides of her head, her vision fracturing into the wide, panoramic, and deeply alien perspective of a prehistoric prey animal. A child's skin began to shift and flow, developing the chameleonic, color-shifting abilities of a long-extinct cephalopod ancestor. But the transformations were not just physical. The protocol, as it tore through their genetic code, was unlocking the instincts that were encoded with the physical traits. The primal predatory rage of a pre-human carnivore, the territorial aggression of a reptile, the blind, swarming panic of a herd animal, these ancient, powerful, and long-suppressed emotions began to surge through the human population. The serene, ordered cities of the Federation began to crumble, not from an outside attack, but from a war that had erupted from within their own bodies and their own minds. From their great, silent vessel, the progenitors observed the chaos. And for the first time in their billion-year history, their serene, logical consciousness was touched by a new and deeply unsettling emotion, confusion. Their simple, elegant delete command had not just failed, it had resulted in a cascading, unpredictable, and horrifyingly creative error. They had intended to prune a single, overgrown branch from the tree of life. Instead, they had inadvertently caused the entire, chaotic and terrifyingly diverse forest of that tree's evolutionary history to sprout from that one branch. All at once, Eris Thorn, his own body now a battleground of conflicting ancestral urges, the cold, patient stillness of the reptile warring with the warm-blooded anxiety of the mammal, stumbled to his lab's window. He looked out at the city of Hope's Landing as it descended into a beautiful, terrible, and Darwinian nightmare. He saw a man with the powerful, digitigrade legs of a prehistoric wolf chasing down a woman who was gliding between the buildings on newly sprouted leathery wings. He saw a group of people, their skin now a tough gray pachyderm-like hide, huddling together in a defensive, herd-like formation. He understood, with a clarity that was both a scientific breakthrough and a cry of absolute despair, what was happening. The progenitors had feared what humanity might one day become, and in their arrogant, compassionate, and terrible wisdom, they had just fast-forwarded the process. They had not unmade their experiment. They had, with a single elegant command, given birth to a monster of their own and our own making. The initial phase of the Great Change, as it came to be known, was a maelstrom of pure Darwinian chaos. The gleaming, ordered cities of humanity became brutal, urban jungles, where the newly awakened instincts of a billion years of evolution played out in terrifying fashion. The hierarchies of society, wealth, status, intellect, crumbled, replaced by the far older and more unforgiving hierarchy of the food chain. Those who had manifested the traits of apex predators, the wolves and the great cats, found themselves at the top. Those who had drawn the genetic short straw, awakening the instincts of herd animals or skittish prey, found themselves hunted. It was a brutal, planet-wide culling, and the progenitors watched from their silent, pearlescent vessel, their confusion slowly curdling into a new and far more clinical sense of scientific interest. They had failed to delete the experiment, but they had inadvertently created a new and far more fascinating one. Eris Thorn survived the first 48 hours on pure, animal cunning, a quality he was horrified to discover he possessed. The conflict within his own body had settled into a strange and terrifying equilibrium. The cold, patient stillness of his reptilian ancestors allowed him to remain hidden for hours, his breathing slowing to a near imperceptible crawl. The warm-blooded mammalian anxiety, however, kept him alert. His senses sharpened to an impossible degree. Every rustle of the wind, every distant, inhuman shriek, registering as a potential threat. He was a creature of perfect paranoia, a walking, breathing fusion of warm and cold-blooded survival instincts. He made his way through the shattered ruins of Hope's Landing, a ghost in his own city. The air was thick with alien pheromones and the coppery tang of blood. He saw things that would forever haunt the dark corners of his memory. He saw a woman, her skin now a beautiful, iridescent carapace, inject a paralyzing venom into her victim with a flick of her newly formed stinger. He saw a man, his arms elongated and covered in thick, shaggy fur, brachiate through the canyons between the skyscrapers with the terrifying, hooting grace of a great ape. This was not humanity anymore. It was a bestiary, a living library of every creature that had ever fought for survival on the violent, beautiful, and terrible mud ball of old Earth. But amidst the horror, he began to see something else. He saw patterns. He saw emergent behavior that was not just blind, instinctual chaos. In the city's central park, a group of people who had all manifested avian traits, wings, talons, hollow bones, had formed a flock. They were not fighting each other. They were coordinating, using their aerial advantage to hunt and to defend their territory, their cries a new and strangely beautiful form of communication. In the subterranean transit tunnels, a colony of humans with the traits of eusocial insects, ants, termites, were working together with a silent, terrifying efficiency. Building barricades and digging new tunnels, their individual identities subsumed into the greater purpose of the hive. The chaos was beginning to self-organize. Humanity was not just reverting to its ancestral parts. It was, in a bizarre and terrifying way, recreating the very ecosystems from which those parts had come. The progenitors observed this emergent order with a new and profound sense of alarm. Their initial confusion was giving way to a dawning cosmic horror. They had not just unleashed a monster, they had unleashed an entire self-replicating and violently adaptive biosphere. The human experiment had not just failed, it had become a contaminant, a biological plague of unparalleled creativity and chaos. The new hybridized forms of life that were now stalking the ruins of the human cities were not just animals. They were animals with human intelligence, human memory, and a latent and terrifying capacity for tool use and abstract thought. They were an evolutionary accelerant, a force of biological change so rapid and so unpredictable that it threatened to destabilize the very concept of a natural order. The progenitor that had delivered the initial judgment descended once more, not to the assembly halls of a dead government, but to the broken, blood-stained plaza at the heart of Hope's Landing. It did not come with an offer of peace. It came with a scalpel. Its form, once a thing of pure, shimmering light, was now harder, more defined, its geometry sharp and weaponized. It was no longer a keeper of a garden. It was an exterminator. It began to move through the city, and where it passed, the new, vibrant, and terrifying life that was blossoming simply ceased. It did not kill with energy beams or physical force. It wielded a far more fundamental weapon. It was a walking, sentient field of biological negation. It could target a specific genetic sequence, the reptilian, the avian, the insectoid, and simply turn it off, causing the transformed humans to collapse into a pile of undifferentiated organic sludge. It was a clean, efficient, and utterly merciless process. The progenitor was not just killing them, it was editing them out of existence, one evolutionary branch at a time. Eris watched the extermination from his hiding place, a new, cold, and reptilian rage building in his heart. This was not a compassionate act of euthanasia. This was a purge. The progenitors were not just cleaning their lab, they were burning the lab notes, erasing the evidence of their own catastrophic failure. He felt a fierce, protective, and utterly illogical loyalty to the new, monstrous forms of life that his species had become. They were terrifying, they were violent, but they were alive. They were the chaotic, beautiful, and terrible children of old Earth, and they were his people. As the progenitor passed his hiding place, its aura of pure biological negation washing over him, Eris did something he did not know he was capable of. He did not just hide. He adapted. The progenitor's negation field was designed to target and erase specific, activated ancestral gene sequences. As the wave of energy washed over him, Eris felt the reptilian code that was coursing through his veins begin to unravel. He felt the cold, patient stillness, the sharpened senses, the phantom tale, all beginning to dissolve. But in that split second, a different and far stranger instinct flared to life, an instinct that was not from a predator or a prey animal, but from something far older and more subtle. It was the genetic memory of a virus. Deep in the dark genome, in the chaotic scrapbook of his DNA, was the code of 1 billion years of viral infections, the ghosts of ancient plagues that had been defeated, absorbed and repurposed by his ancestors. And a virus, when faced with an existential threat, does not fight. It changes. It rewrites its own code. It adapts. Eris did not consciously control the process. His own intelligent mind was just a passenger. His body, his very DNA, took over. In the instant that the progenitor's field tried to erase his reptilian traits, his viral ancestral memory activated a new set of dormant genes. He felt a nauseating full-body contortion, a sensation of his very cells being rewritten. The progenitor's field, which was looking for a specific reptilian key, suddenly found that the lock had been changed. The wave of negation passed over him, leaving him trembling, nauseous, but alive. He looked down at his hands. The faint scaly pattern on his skin was gone. In its place, his skin had taken on a pale, translucent, almost gelatinous quality. He felt a new and bizarre sensation, a low-level bioelectric field that now emanated from his own body. He had, in a single terrifying and involuntary act of biological survival, swapped one monstrous adaptation for another. He had unlocked the traits of a deep-ocean bioluminescent organism from the Cambrian era. He had survived, not by being stronger, but by being more adaptable. He had survived by being a better mistake. And he was not the only one. Across the city, the progenitor's purge was beginning to fail. Its weapon was too precise, too logical. It was designed to fight a predictable enemy. And humanity, in its new, monstrously diverse form, was anything but predictable. A woman with avian traits about to be erased suddenly found her hollow bones filling with a dense cartilaginous material, her body activating the deep-pressure survival traits of a creature from the ocean's crushing depths. A man with the instincts of a wolf found his predatory rage replaced by the cold, calculating, and utterly alien intelligence of an octopus, his skin shifting to perfectly match the rubble around him. The great change was not just an explosion. It was a chain reaction. Every attempt by the progenitors to simplify the problem was only making the problem more complex, more creative, and more terrifyingly, beautifully alive. The progenitor paused in its silent, deadly march. Its serene, logical mind was, for the second time, experiencing the deeply unsettling sensation of a failed hypothesis. Its purge was not working. For every genetic fire it extinguished, 2 new and even stranger fires would erupt from the ashes. It was playing a game of evolutionary whack-a-mole against a species that had 1 billion years of practice at not dying. It began to understand its mistake. It had perceived the chaos of the human genome as a flaw. It now saw that the chaos was the entire point. Humanity's strength was not in its current, stable form, but in the vast, silent, and deeply disordered library of its own past. The dark genome was not a scrapbook. It was an arsenal, a catalog of 1 billion years of tried and tested survival strategies. The Ancestor Protocol had not just opened the book. It had thrown the entire chaotic library onto the floor, and now every human was a living, breathing, and terrifyingly adaptive story. From his lab, Eris began to do what he did best. He began to gather data. He had survived. And he now knew that the key to their survival was not to fight the change, but to learn to control it. The transformations in their chaotic, spontaneous nature were as likely to be a death sentence as they were a salvation. The man with the gills had drowned in the air. The woman with the panoramic vision had been unable to process the sensory overload and had walked off a building. The key was not just to adapt, but to adapt with purpose. He began to broadcast. Using the city's emergency communication system, he sent out a message, not of words, but of pure biological data. He sent out the readings of his own transformation, the before and after, the reptilian and the bioluminescent. It was a message to the other survivors, a demonstration that the change could be influenced if not controlled. He was not a commander giving an order. He was a scientist publishing his findings in the most desperate and brutal peer review process in the history of life. The response was a slow, dawning wave of collective and monstrous understanding. Across the planet, the survivors, the new, strange, and terrifying children of Earth, began to experiment. They began to focus their will to tap into the deep instinctual knowledge that was now raging in their blood. They began to learn the language of their own DNA. The progenitors' purge had failed. The age of monsters had ended. The age of a new and far more terrifying form of humanity was about to begin. They had been a species that used tools. Now they were a species that had learned to become the tool, the weapon, and the hope, all at the same time. The age of monsters gave way to the age of artisans. The progenitor exterminator, faced with an enemy that refused to be defined, retreated to the silent, pearlescent vessel in orbit. It did not flee. It began to observe, its cold, logical mind trying to categorize a phenomenon that had moved beyond chaos and was beginning to resemble a new and terrifyingly complex form of order. Down on the surface of Gaia Secundus and a dozen other worlds, the survivors of the Great Change began the arduous process of rebuilding not just their cities, but themselves. Thorne's broadcasts became the foundation of a new global society. He was no longer just a scientist. He was a teacher, a cartographer of the inner world of the human genome. He and his team at the Kepler Institute established the new science of genetic artistry, the conscious and willed control of the Ancestor Protocol's chaotic fallout. Humanity learned that the transformations did not have to be random or permanent. They could be controlled, shifted, and even combined. They were not just a collection of monstrous forms. They were a fluid, living palette of biological potential. A new culture emerged, one of profound and beautiful biological diversity. Great cities were rebuilt, their architecture reflecting the new nature of their inhabitants. Avian humans, the corvids, built soaring, delicate spires connected by high-tension wires, their society a constant, graceful dance in the sky. The insectoid Formicidae constructed vast, elegant subterranean warrens, their communities a model of silent, selfless cooperation. The Saurians, those who had embraced their reptilian heritage, built low, sun-warmed habitats of dark, heat-absorbing stone, their culture one of patient, watchful contemplation. But these were not new species. They were human. They could, with concentration and will, shed their adaptations, returning to the baseline human form. They were all still one people, but a people who now had access to a library of 1 billion years of life. A construction worker could consciously activate the brute strength of a great ape to lift a heavy beam, then revert to their human form to read the blueprints. A doctor, performing delicate microsurgery, could momentarily borrow the multi-lensed, hyper-focused eyes of an ancient trilobite. They had not lost their humanity. They had expanded its definition in a way that was both beautiful and profoundly terrifying. They had become a species of voluntary and temporary gods and monsters. The progenitors observed this new, controlled chaos with a sense of rising systemic dread. Their experiment had not just failed to be deleted. It had become a new, and in their view, far more dangerous form of life. Humanity was no longer a simple, chaotic variable contained to a few star systems. They were now a metamorphic contagion, a species with the potential to consciously direct its own evolution, to adapt to any environment, to overcome any threat. They were a biological force of nature, and the progenitors, in their cold, cosmic calculus, reached a new and final conclusion. The experiment could not be contained. The lab itself would have to be sterilized. The great pearlescent vessel in Earth's orbit, which had been a silent observer, began to change. its beautiful organic curves hardened into sharp, weaponized angles. Its soft, internal light condensed into a brilliant and terrible point of pure energy. The progenitors had decided that their first, compassionate attempt at erasure and their second, clinical attempt at purging had been flawed by a fundamental error. They had treated humanity as a problem of biology. They now understood that it was a problem of physics. They were preparing to unmake the entire Sol system, not with a bomb, but with a far more elegant and final solution. They were going to deploy a localized high-dimension reality distorter, a weapon that would simply collapse the star, the planets, and every living thing within 100 astronomical units into a brief, hot, and utterly final singularity. It was the ultimate failsafe, the cosmic equivalent of formatting a corrupted hard drive. The progenitors sent one final, silent message to their wayward children, a thought of profound, and now truly final, pity. The chaos will end. There will be silence. The threat was not a secret. The human network, the new shared consciousness of the transformed, felt the progenitors' intent as a cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear wave of pure, logical purpose. They felt the great weapon powering up. They felt the silent cosmic countdown. They had days, perhaps hours, before their sun, their worlds, and their entire beautiful, monstrous civilization would simply cease to exist. In the great silent war room of the new human civilization, a psychic space, a shared consciousness where Eris, the Corvid leaders, the Formicid queens, and the Saurian elders met as equals, a final desperate plan was forged. They could not match the progenitors' technology. They could not fight a battle of physics. Their only weapon was the very thing that had caused this crisis in the first place, their own chaotic and now controllable biology. Aris presented his theory, a gamble so audacious it bordered on insanity. The progenitors were their creators. The Ancestor Protocol was their lock and key. The dark genome was a program they had written. But the progenitors were not gods of pure energy. They too were biological beings, however advanced. They too had evolved. And somewhere, in the deep, silent history of their own ancient DNA, they had their own ghosts, their own chaotic, primal past that their serene, logical present had long since suppressed and forgotten. The key works both ways, Aris projected into the shared mind, his thought a beacon of desperate hope. They used the protocol to unlock our past. We will use it to unlock theirs. The plan was to create a new protocol, a progenitor protocol, a biological feedback loop that would reflect the key back onto the hand of the one who had turned it. It would be a targeted viral message carried not on a radio wave, but on a wave of pure, weaponized genetic information. It would require a level of biological control, of focused collective will that had never been attempted. They would need to turn their entire species into a single, functioning, and impossibly complex biological weapon. The effort was monumental. The Formicidae, with their hive-mind consciousness, became the psychic amplifiers, their vast, interconnected network focusing the will of the entire species. The Corvids, with their mastery of the skies and their sharpened senses, became the targeting system, their collective gaze fixed on the progenitor vessel. The Saurians, with their cold, patient discipline, became the shield, their combined psychic strength creating a buffer against the progenitor's own immense mental power. And at the heart of it all was Eris, the first and most versatile of the new humans. His own body a living laboratory, a biological nexus through which the final, desperate weapon of their species would be deployed. As the progenitor vessel began to glow with the terrible, final light of its world-ending weapon, the counterattack was launched. It was a silent, invisible beam of pure biological information, a focused prayer from 1 trillion monstrous, beautiful souls aimed at the heart of their god. The progenitor protocol struck the pearlescent hull of the great ship, and for a moment nothing happened. The final terrible light of the weapon grew brighter, and then it flickered. Inside the vessel, the progenitors, those serene, perfect beings of pure light and logic, felt a ghost stir in their own machine. The protocol, their own perfect code turned against them, did not kill them. It did something far worse. It reminded them, It unlocked the billion-year-old door to their own, messy, chaotic, and long-forgotten evolutionary past. A progenitor, a being that had not known a singular physical form for eons, suddenly felt the ghost of a beating heart in its chest. Another felt the primal, illogical surge of adrenaline, the ancient, predatory rage of a creature that had once hunted in the primordial swamps of its own long-dead world. A third was overwhelmed by a sudden and completely illogical wave of parental love, the fierce, protective instinct for a child it had never had. Their serene, unified consciousness shattered. Their perfect logical plan faltered. The great, world-ending weapon, deprived of its focused, singular purpose, fizzled and died. The progenitors were no longer a single unified god. They were a billion-year-old chorus of their own, noisy, chaotic, and beautifully, terribly flawed ancestors. They were no longer just the keepers of the garden. They were the garden itself. The war ended not in a victory, but in a profound and deeply unsettling stalemate. The progenitors, now locked in a desperate internal battle with their own newly awakened chaotic souls, could no longer pass judgment on humanity. Their quest for serene cosmic order had been irrevocably contaminated by their own repressed history. Humanity, in turn, had not defeated its gods. It had simply forced them to remember that they were once, and now were again, just as beautifully, terribly alive as their own chaotic, monstrous, and indomitable children. Across the silent void, the two species, creator and creation, monster and god, both now beautifully, terribly flawed, regarded each other. The silence was broken. A new and far more interesting conversation was about to begin.